So, with only 1 year of training as a psychiatrist, and typically it's either a 3 or 4 year program, I was assigned to be a psychiatrist at the Navy Drug Rehabilitation Center in Jacksonville, Florida. This was kind of a career-ending assignment if you were in the military.
Okay.
I mean, if you're a fighter pilot or you're a gunner on an aircraft carrier, the last thing you want to do is deal with drug-dependent sailors.
Right.
So when they set this program up, and there was one San Diego on the West Coast, I was in Jacksonville on the East Coast, and we took care of sailors. Well, a lot of them came from Vietnam, but also from the Mediterranean. But it was kind of a dead end for your career. First 6 months, we were just setting the program up, so we had no patients. So I basically spent 6 months reading the vast majority of the literature about drug abuse at that time. There was a very famous book by a professor from Harvard, Lester Greenspoon, Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding.
So you've got a lot of knowledge of the history of war.
Yeah, I mean, I was active in war on drugs. I was a lieutenant commander, and I got pictures of me in my uniform. Actually, the military would fly me around to lecture to the troops about the evil of drug abuse.
Right.
And when I finished my 2-year assignment, they offered me a great deal to fly around the world at Navy bases to talk about it. But I mean, as we talk more, you'll find out I quote came out of the Cannabis class in 2009, and that was based on social justice.
Right.
And that's been primarily by my approach, because prohibition, whatever its intent, in the way it's enforced, is a racist law.
VETSGROW had come an awfully long way since its humble beginnings as a one-man grow show. We'd found our veteran willing to grow on camera, and with the backing of Monster Gardens along with a partnership of donors, we'd supplied him with a complete garden and plants to grow in it. And while there is still plenty more to the veteran story yet to come, it's high time we got going with the growing part of VETSGROW. In the last episode, we'd left Al's baby plants in a very makeshift environment after poor planning on my part meant the installation didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped.
We have a bad switch on the light, so we will not switch off. Both switches are on and one lamp's on and one lamp's off, and that could have happened in transit.
Thankfully, the team at Monster Gardens had swung past Al's the very next day to finish hooking up the ventilation and to hang a 2-foot, 2-bulb T5 fluorescent fixture to get the plants through their first few weeks of veg. We'd also set up Al's harvest schedule to be as simple as possible. All of the selected strains were to run on a basic 8-week vegetative growth cycle, after which they'd be flipped into an 8-week flowering cycle. We'll be covering each of the steps in greater detail as we go, the first of which is of course the correct transplant procedure, and even though I'd managed to make a mess out of the initial transplant, it wasn't long before it was time to move Al's babies out of their nursery pots and into their permanent home. Al's new garden is a very simple setup. 6 plants each in a 5-gallon fabric pot with accompanying saucer under a 630-watt ceramic metal halide high-intensity discharge lamp. Also inside is a 6-inch fan and charcoal filter attached to ducting to handle airflow and odour control. We'd even supplied Al with a drip emitter system to automate watering, but he'd elected instead to hand water them, meaning the only part of this garden running on autopilot was his lamp timer. Today we are putting the fixed CMH back into the tent, transplanting from these tiny little pots here, which is what we originally transplanted the grow down cubes into, and we're going to put them in these, that could have been fun, 5-gallon fabric pots with handles and some simple saucers in there. The transplant process is a simple task that's well worth taking your time over, as it's the last time you'll see your plant's root system until harvest. Start by simply filling your pots with soil media until they're about 3/4 full. Make a small indent in the soil, sprinkle in some mycorrhizae to help boost nutrient uptake, then place the plant and its root bowl into the indent, before loosely covering with fresh soil media. We're using fabric pots in our garden to avoid the root issues that can occur in solid pots. Because fabric pots are porous, they allow some air to circulate in the pot, especially at the edges. Roots naturally stop growing when they detect air. In effect, the root tip is burned off by the exposure, which encourages the root to rebranch instead of creating a twisted bound mass that's often found in solid containers. It's an effect commonly known as air pruning. The other happy side effect of fabric pots is that it's nearly impossible to overwater plants. Speaking of which, that's the next step in transplanting, watering them in. But before you do this, take a moment to lift up each of your full pots so you know roughly how much they weigh without water. Then fill them up until the water starts seeping out of the sides and the media is fully saturated. Lift them again so you can feel the weight difference. When the plant and pot are roughly half as heavy as when they're saturated, that's when they'll be needing water. And with a hands-on garden like ours, it's important to get a feel for tasks like watering, as watering schedules can also wildly vary due to prevailing conditions or even factors like the time of year. The vegetative stage of plant growth is usually called veg, mainly because it's easier to say in a sentence without spraining your tongue. The veg stage is a purely subjective period of time, the length of which depends mostly on what you want it to be. Most of the gardeners that I've spoken to say 8 weeks is pretty standard in an indoor garden. But really the only limits are those of cost, the available space, and of course time. Cannabis plants will stay in the veg state almost indefinitely, just as long as they don't get that magical first 12-hour nap, commonly referred to in the industry as the flip. Flipping a plant acts as a trigger for the plant to switch from its veg to flowering stage. But what about the light cycle during veg? Well, oddly enough, veg stage cannabis plants can be grown 24 hours a day. Seeing as Al was paying for the power consumption himself, we stuck to a more traditional 18-hour on, 6-hour off cycle. However, once that switch to the 12-12 cycle is made, exposing plants to light during their dark period can prove disastrous. But we'll get to all of that in due course, because we now have to pause for some light conversation and talk about probably the biggest decision a new grower makes: what lighting to use. You might be thinking that as someone that's spent over 3 years testing grow lights and hosting the TESTLAB show, I'd spec a super trick top of the line system with all the bells and whistles. And you'd be dead wrong. we went with a very simple 630 watt ceramic metal halide unit for a number of reasons, but mainly because, apart from me breaking it, CMH is a very reliable and well-known technology. It also produces a great sunlight spectrum with a good chunk of UV. That's good for both veg and flower phases of the cannabis plant life cycle. They're also very well priced and are about 30% more efficient to run than their metal halide equivalent. And finally, because it fits perfectly into our first season key principle, KISS, or keep it simple, stupid. So apologies to all the lighting nerds out there for the lack of stimulation. But don't worry, this isn't the last time we'll be discussing grow lights. Our only real concern with choosing the CMH was heat, because ceramic metal halide gas discharge bulbs generate a ton of it, and as my ride up to Al's had already shown, it can get hotter than the devil's armpit up here.
It's a pretty hot day today, as you can see outside. I'm sweating like a beast. We're fully transferred now. We're into the 5-gallon pots. We've hung the CMH. The switch on this lamp has been pretty much fixed. And here's the babies in their new home underneath the sunlight ceramic metal halide lamp. Here we are. Only got one side running for the moment at 315 watts. We'll give them a couple of days to get used to that. It's a much more intense outputs and spectra than a T5. Let them get used to the UV, and yeah, then we'll watch them veg and shoot up. And what they're trying to do now is, we've got a bit of a heat problem here. We're trying to avoid getting an air conditioning unit in here. If we can get more airflow through here, coming through the carbon filter up there, it goes out to the tank, and then we're up here on the ceiling. Now, if you can get this as straight as possible, your exhaust vent, then the fan does less work pushing the air out. So get rid of elbows, 90-degree turns. You want it nice and steady. So that was an interesting pro tip. Always have more than one thermometer. Get several and place them in different parts of where you're growing. Like there's one just up here. There's another one over here on the wall. And there's one inside. The reason being, everywhere creates a microenvironment. Everywhere, especially in a garage like this. The door's open, the door's closed. So we are just about done here. Our tent is now much better electrically. This is a much higher gauge of cable which should be able to take the amperage. So we are good for another week. Right, I'll see you in editing land. Hi to future me.
I left Al drinking from the font of knowledge that is the Monster Gardens Grow team, and returned to my home studio to begin the lengthy process of reviewing over 100 hours of interviews and conversations that I'd filmed as part of creating the show.
Maybe I can continue my story from the veterans, how...
Absolutely, start there.
Okay.
Perfect.
Should we ready to go?
Yeah, it's all
Okay.
I've turned it on ages ago.
Well, as one of the things I did, like many other physicians in the Navy, I started moonlighting. And actually in Jacksonville, Florida, there was a physician, Dr. Bill Hake, who was the third president of the American College of Emergency Physicians. So I started moonlighting in emergency medicine, kind of found my niche, wanted to come back to San Francisco. At that time there were a lot of opportunities. Emergency medicine really evolved out of the Vietnam War. So basically, you know, practicing emergency medicine full-time, Marin County, very high use rate, you know, personal experience. We admitted an alcoholic virtually every day. I've seen, you know, major seizure disorders, people die of an alcohol overdose. but never had to admit a patient to the hospital of cannabis. Perhaps the most common reason someone came to the hospital related to cannabis is in Marin County. If you were a juvenile and you got busted and were having to go to either juvenile hall or jail overnight, policy in Marin is the police had to bring you to the emergency department at Marin General Hospital, we're basically the county's hospital, where we would have to certify the emergency physician it was safe for this 16-year-old to be in juvenile hall overnight. And it became very apparent that the vast majority of kids being brought in for medical clearance either came from Marin City, were Afro-American, or came from the Canal and were Latino. And this really just duplicates what happens across the country, is if you're a person of color, you have a 3.5 to 4 times likelihood to be arrested and prosecuted as if you're white. And that clearly is what happened in Marin County, just like it happened many other places throughout the country. The injustice of this really began to bother me, and so in 2009 I wrote a resolution asking the California Medical Association to support the legalization, regulation, and taxation of cannabis. They modified the resolution and said the CMA acknowledges that prohibition is a failed public health policy and that there is a growing demand for patients, so physicians need to learn more about the issue. I was then tracked down by the people who had the 2010 proposition, became a physician spokesman for that was Prop 19. This is the one that was supported by Richard Lee from Oaksterdam. So that's where I really became kind of a public advocate for legalization of cannabis. Took the California Medical Association, I reintroduced the same resolution in 2010, asked them to endorse 19, and they decided to set up a task force to study the issue. I got appointed to the Marijuana Technical Advisory Committee. A year later, we issued a report, a white paper, in which the California Medical Association recommended legalization, taxation. That was unanimously adopted by the Board of the Trustees of the CMA. And as you're probably aware, in 2016, when California legalized cannabis, the main proponent was the California Medical Association, and the physician who wrote the proponents why we should legalize cannabis was Dr. Lyman from the CMA. The California Nursing Association also was in support. California Hospital Association was opposed, as was Dianne Feinstein, and I had the privilege of being one of the co-authors of the rebuttal to Senator Feinstein.
Thanks to long-term advocates and professionals like Dr. Larry championing cannabis legalization, political leaders are listening at the state level. But at the federal level, the resistance to change remains, and some are actively trying to turn back the clock. But what's impossible to ignore are the stories of lives being changed around the world by people who are rediscovering the amazing properties of this plant.
Okay, so it's Monday night around 9 o'clock, July the 23rd, and these guys slept for about 6 hours today until about 6 o'clock, and they got fed, they got sprayed, they got watered, and they're looking pretty good. This guy over here is in the wind, so he's kind of leaning over a little bit. I might do a little shift to these guys and move them around. But overall, I think they look pretty good.
But for veterans specifically, there's another reason driving the migration to cannabis use. And it's a story I've heard repeatedly from veterans since I started VETSGROW.
You know, PTSD, to make it simple, is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. Mm-hmm. Not everybody goes through that. Yes, car wrecks, plane crashes will give you PTSD, short term.
Right.
But we did it for minimum of 4 and some 8 to 10 years or more.
Right. The first study I read about this when I was putting
Right.
together my introduction says what they from Afghanistan and Iraq. The Afghanistan and Iraq was 20% reported
Yes.
PTSD.
Yes,
That's
which
1/5.
actually, that's low.
Right, because people don't want to report it, right?
It's the same thing as the suicide rate they portray today is 22 a day.
Yeah,
That to me is low.
I can believe it. That's
There's
reported.
more.
That's what's reported.
That's right, that's just what they reported. It doesn't count for people running into a tree and killing themselves or running off the road to do it.
Right, right.
And women have a bigger incidence of suicide than men do. Well, a lot of it's because of the MST,
Right.
which is military sexual trauma.
Yes, I've heard
And as
about
many,
that.
if not more, men have that happen to them as women do.
Right.
But we don't talk about it.
No.
We keep it inside, and we live in misery all our life.
Right.
We don't have a exciting or great life. We end up with divorces. All this stuff hits us, especially when you finally retire, because during the job you're concentrating on the work you have to do.
Purpose.
You don't have to think. As soon as you retire, you sit in the easy chair, and guess what pops up? All this crud starts coming up, and Vietnam vets right now are a higher incident of suicide than the Afghan and Iraq war is.
That's what I heard. And instances of heroin and opium overdose.
Yes. Yes, and the biggest thing is the opiates that are what killed a lot of us. They finally cut back on it. It used to be that you had a pain, give you a pill.
You can come in, it's fine.
We all have pain. I've had a lot of it through my life of physical pain, stuff that's happened to me.
Right, okay.
You know, and for years VA was have a pill, have a pill, have a pill. It was like better medicine through medication.
So it's important that you wade carefully, to be honest. There's still a federal prohibition in place. There really are criminal penalties. This is not a President Clinton administration, so be mindful of that. That's why we talked in the early part about having a personal use crop. If you really want, to the best of your ability, not get in trouble, then don't get into this. But if you want to minimize risks associated with this, then you might want to look at your personal use limits for possession and ensure that it's in a locality, maybe on your private property, and you keep it small and quiet. How do you seek out help? Well, you probably, as a rule of thumb, want to keep it to private contacts, not put things in writing, and you don't want to elevate it immediately to law enforcement, the government, and doctors. So that's why we talked about those private groups like a local county military veterans group or association. Well, what about the typical military veteran where I don't have enough money to afford medical care. I have to go to the VA's hospital. We already have a host of issues associated with delays and quality right there and then. But I need help. I need to know what's safe access for medical cannabis, and I would like to talk to my doctor. Well, you can't. There's still risks associated with that. First off, they can't write you a prescription. Second of all, that hospital, VA hospital, cannot issue you medical cannabis. And 3, you may jeopardize your own VA benefits by going into that doctor's meeting and letting them scribble down what you're trying to do or what your personal use is on the side. So there's still a lot of pitfalls here for a military veteran.
It wasn't long before it became obvious that the veterans' fight for access to medical cannabis was part of a larger battle over cannabis prohibition at the federal level. And that's a battle that has deep roots in racism, social activism, and the decades of mistruths spread by agencies ranging from the medical establishment to those that underpin cannabis prohibition itself. Schedule 1's statement of fact that cannabis has no medical value.
All right, so it's about 7-ish. Just checking on these little girls. They look pretty nice. I just gave them a little spray and watered them. I might put a little more dirt down here and over here. And it looks like this little shoot on top. There's a little peak in there. I don't know what that's about. I'll have to keep an eye on that. Anyway, I rotated them a little bit yesterday, so they're in a different position than originally. But that's it. Until next time.
So I think the pendulum has swung. I mean, California obviously was the first state to legalize medicinal cannabis back in, what was it,
96, wasn't it?
Yeah, 1996. And actually I became the physician spokesman in Colorado. I'm past president of the American College of Emergency Physicians. We had our annual meeting in Denver, and I was tracked down by advocates in Denver and actually sent out a letter to all the physicians of the Colorado Medical Association asking for their support. I have an older brother who is a retired physician in Pueblo, and he got a call from one of his colleagues and I just got this letter from this Bedard. Is it any relation to you? And other than calling me to express his angst that I had sent out a letter, I don't think he talked to me for 6 months. So he's on the Republican side of the family. Unfortunately, suffers from Parkinson's disease, numerous medications, but refuses to try medical cannabis. And there is clearly growing evidence and basic research that shows cannabis helps with Parkinson's, particularly for the spasticity, rigidity, can help with the pain, but my Republican brother just refuses to try it.
Okay, so I just woke these babies up. They've been sleeping for about 6 hours. They're looking pretty good, except the temperature in here is way too hot, and the light's been off. So when I turn this, now that this light is back on, the temperature's gonna.
The big fight right now is the former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, just joined. This was, and when we say just, I mean like in the last few months, a cannabis company on the board of directors, and he has basically said mea culpa. Now that I look at this issue, maybe we should have done more when I was in power. We also have the minority leader in the Senate, Charles Schumer, who's also come out for decriminalization. There is a big push for decriminalization.
Mitch McConnell
as well, going back to Kentucky. Don't forget, there's also the big question about big pharma and big tobacco.
We're just waiting for them to step in.
Exactly, so that it's going from decriminalization. Another possibility is, remember, this is a Schedule I narcotic. Another thing is to just drop it, reschedule
Right.
from Schedule 1 down to Schedule 2.
Which actually may present a lot more problems than if you just left it as a Schedule 1, or clearly if you deschedulized completely, that's optimal. But it may create more problems if you deschedule it from a 1 to a 2, because now that would be totally germane of pharma companies. And so now what do anybody...
They get to play and no one else does.
Then they get to play and no one else does.
Coming up in episode 5 is actually a whole bunch of stuff that I thought would fit into episode 4, like the NCIA visit and the interview with Sweetleaf Joe. And as Sonoma starts to bake in the midsummer sun, the VETSGROW team start to sweat about Al's garden turning into a barbecue, prompting a lighting rethink and, as a consequence, a change in gardening style.
Thanks. You're an arse. I'm soaked through the bone now. Seriously.
Yeah, it
Just walks up to me and just...
rubs up against you.
For me.